guys, it's Vanessa from Unmasked. It's been a while since we've done a Gabby Petito video, but there is some new information that is worth discussion. It seems impossible that I can despise Brian Laundrie any more than I already do, but he's managed to piss many people off posthumously since this 8-page note was released on Friday. Before we get started, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so that you'll be notified of my other videos. I have my other Gabby videos linked in the description below that walk through the entire timeline and details of what happened. I would highly recommend you check those out to refresh yourselves, because as we go through this letter, I'm going to tie Brian's statements into the details of the case and point out what I feel are some important clues or tells, whatever you want to call it, to what actually happened to Gabby. As you probably know by now, an 8-page note that Brian Laundrie wrote at the end of his life has been released by his attorney, and boy is it interesting and full of crap, in my opinion, but let's break it down. I have my theories about what happened, and I'm going to share those, so just take that for what it's worth. Of course, these are subject to change if new information emerges, but for now, these are my thoughts. The Laundrie family attorney, Steve Bertolino, released this letter as part of an exchange of property between the Laundries and Gabby's family. As you probably already know, Gabby's family is suing Brian's family. Gabby's family is arguing that the Laundries had a duty to speak up about where their daughter was, and they're asserting that Brian called his parents on the way home and told them that he killed Gabby. The Laundries are arguing that they did not have an obligation to speak and that they had a right to remain silent. The Laundries have not been charged with any crimes, of course. They did have their first court appearance on June 22nd for a hearing on the Laundries' motion to dismiss the suit. The judge has not made a ruling on it yet, but if the judge denies the motion to dismiss, this lawsuit should see the inside of a courtroom by August. That should be really interesting because I think we're going to get some new information on the case that we normally would not get to see. Now, for some quick context before I start the letter, when Brian left the Laundrie home on September 14th, he left with a dry bag, a tent, flares. I did an interview with Dave Canterbury from Dual Survivor like 6 months ago. It's linked in the description below as well. He had some really interesting insights. An excellent point that was hit was that if Brian entered the reserve to end his life, why would he bring a dry bag and supplies? Why not just do it in the car? If you couple that with the fact that Gabby's family is claiming that the Laundries were arranging for him to leave the country, they bought him a new cell phone on September 4th, they waited several days to report him missing, it does make one wonder, did something go wrong? Brian was not that far from his car when he ended his life. Did he get injured? Was he trying to get back to his car? There are so many unanswered questions still, and I hope that we get some closure to these if the lawsuit continues. So let's get into this letter. Again, if you guys have heard this too many times over the weekend, just jump ahead to the timestamp in the description. However, I think it's really important when lining it up with the facts that we know to compare the two. Gabby, I wish I was right at your side. I wish I could be talking to you right now. I'd be going through every memory we've made, getting even more excited for the future. I can't live without you. I've lost every day we could have spent together, every holiday. I'll never get to play with, it's unintelligible, again. Never go hiking with TJ. I loved you more than anything. I can't bear to look at our photos, to recall great times, because it is why I cannot go on. When I close my eyes, I will think of laying on the roof of the van, falling asleep to the sight of a meteor shower at the Crystal Geyser. I will always love you. If you were reading Gab's journal, looking at the photos from our life together, flipping through old cards, you wouldn't want to live a day without her. Knowing that every day you'll wake up without her, you wouldn't want to wake up. I'm sorry to everyone this will affect. Gabby was the love of my life, but I know adored by many. I'm so very sorry to her family because I love them. I'd consider her younger siblings my best of friends. I'm sorry to my family. This is a shock to them as well as a terrible grief. They loved as much, if not more than me, a new daughter to my mother, an aunt to my nephews. Please do not make this harder for them. This occurred as an unexpected tragedy. Rushing back to our car, trying to cross the streams of Spread Creek before it got too dark to see, too cold, I hear a splash and a scream. I could barely see. I couldn't find her for a moment, shouted her name. I found her breathing heavily, gasping my name. She was freezing cold. We had just come from the blazing hot national parks in Utah. The temperature had dropped to freezing, and she was soaking wet. I carried her as far as I could down the stream towards the car, stumbling, exhausted, in shock. When my knees buckled and I knew I couldn't safely carry her, I started a fire and spooned her as close to the heat. She was so thin, had already been freezing too long. I couldn't at the time realize that I should have started a fire first, but I wanted her out of the cold back to the car. From where I started the fire, I had no idea how far the car might be. Only knew it was across the creek. When I pulled Gabby out of the water, she couldn't tell me what hurt. She had a small bump on her forehead that eventually got larger. Her feet hurt, her wrist hurt, but she was freezing, shaking violently. While carrying her, she continually made sounds of pain. Laying next to her, she said little, lapsing between violent shakes, gasping in pain, begging for an end to her pain. She would fall asleep, and I would shake her awake, fearing she shouldn't close her eyes if she had a concussion. She would wake in pain, start the whole painful cycle again, while furious that I was the one waking her. She wouldn't let me try to cross the creek, thought like me that this fire would go out in her sleep and she'd freeze. I don't know the extent of Gabby's injuries, only that she was in extreme pain. I ended her life. I thought it was merciful. That is what she wanted. But I see now all the mistakes I made. I panicked. I was in shock. But from the moment I decided, took away her pain, I knew I couldn't go on without her. I rushed home to spend any time I had left with my family. I wanted to drive north and let James or TJ kill me, but I wouldn't want them to spend time in jail over my mistake, even though I'm sure they would have liked to. I'm ending my life not because of a fear of punishment, but rather because I can't stand to live another day without her. I've lost our whole future together, every moment we could have cherished. I'm sorry for everyone's loss. Please do not make life harder for my family. They lost a son and a daughter. The most wonderful girl in the world. Gabby, I'm sorry. I have killed myself by this creek in the hopes that animals may tear me apart, that it may make some of her family happy. Please pick up all of my things. Gabby hated people who litter. Okay, so let's jump right into what I think are clues, what I think are actually nuggets of truth mixed into his lies, and what I think may have happened to her in Wyoming. So we know that back on August 12th in Moab, there was the DV situation that took place on the street in front of the Moonflower, and then it carried into the van, which then subsequently prompted a 911 call and police intervention. I think it's important to look at that event and the events leading up because everything is about patterns. We know they were arguing and that when they got in the car, it escalated to physical violence. On August 25th, Gabby told her mother that she was unsure of her future with Brian and that things were rocky at best. The fact that he pushes so hard in the letter that their future was set together is, in my opinion, a deflection from a possible motive for killing her. I personally believe she wanted out of that relationship and that the incident on August 27th at the Mary Piglet was the final straw. So let's look at August 27th because I think that set off a chain of events that led to her death. We know from the timeline that at 10:30 that morning, Brian was seen alone in the van in Spread Creek. At 1 p.m., they had the infamous incident at the Mary Piglet. It's not that far of a stretch that once they left the Mary Piglet and got into the van together with Brian in a rage, according to witnesses, and Gabby crying, to postulate that it could have escalated into another physical fight. Maybe this one got worse. they would have gotten back to Spread Creek around, it depends on a lot of factors there, but maybe 1:30 or so. I think that much like the incident on August 12th, the fight escalated in the van and he struck her or even hit her head against the dashboard hard enough to cause a head injury that he knew he was going to get in trouble for. He references a bruise in the letter on her forehead that was getting bigger. That's kind of what led me to think dashboard, but again, I'm speculating based on his words and what we know from his patterns and their relationship patterns before, but feel free to let me know what you think in comments if you think I'm reading too much into that or if that is a possible scenario. Okay, so assuming that they returned to Spread Creek around 1:30 or 2 p.m., at 6 p.m., we know that the YouTubers Red, White, and Bethune drove by and saw their van parked at an angle on the road. Now, there was a lot of controversy on this and differing opinions, but when I watched that video over and over and over again, I do agree that it looks like someone shuts the door as they're approaching. That gives us a window from approximately 1:30 or 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. that no one knows what was going on, and I personally believe that that is when Gabby was initially seriously injured. One part that also stuck out was that he says that Gabby was unable to tell him what hurts, but then says that her wrists and feet hurt. That's interesting to me. Why her wrists and feet? How would Brian know where her pain is if she can't tell him? So is it possible that he restrained her if she was injured to prevent her from calling for help? That would explain her wrists and feet hurting. It's just a thought. Don't come for me. This also fits with him leaving for the next 2 days, hitchhiking back, establishing alibi, saying that Gabby was back at the van working on her social media, and being edgy when he returned, asking to be dropped off at the entrance of Spread Creek. Another part of the letter that I thought could support this theory is when he writes that the bruise eventually got bigger. That indicates that some time has lapsed. Also, when he writes that she would fall asleep and would wake in pain and start the painful cycle again. He also writes that she was thin and had already been freezing for too long. That's an interesting choice of words. This would also fit if she had been locked up in the van while he was gone for that day and a half. It was getting down to, I believe it was the 40s at night. Even with a sweatshirt on, she would have been freezing if she was locked in the van for an extended amount of time. Is it possible that maybe he left thinking that she would die while he was gone and she didn't? Then he couldn't blame it on any kind of accident. He couldn't say that maybe she took a hike or a little walk while he was gone and slipped and hit her head. There really wouldn't be any way for him to get out of it. So he would make the decision, as he writes in his letter, to, quote, end her life. That leads me into the next part of this letter and what I think possibly happened next. One part that really stood out to me was where he talks about hearing a splash and a scream in the dark. That part, for whatever reason, hits me more like a memory. We know that Gabby was found down an embankment and across this creek. He returned to Spread Creek on August 29th in the evening, according to witnesses. He would need to wait until dark to take her out of the van and carry her to where she was found so that he wouldn't be seen. I think it's possible that he tried to carry her down there, just like he writes about, and he was exhausted and his knees were buckling, and he got tired and possibly dropped her in the creek, and she did scream, exactly like he said it. That part of the note seems so descriptive that I do think it could be him actually recalling dragging her from the van to her final resting place across the creek and next to the campfire. We know from the coroner, of course, that her cause of death was strangulation. I think that when he got her down there, he probably did make the decision to end her life, and in his narcissistic, twisted, sick mind, he had to frame it for his own ego and for anyone reading the note as if he was just putting her out of her misery. If you notice throughout that note, he uses a lot of distancing language. He doesn't take accountability directly for what he does to her. Even when he does confess, he's kind of putting the blame back on her and making himself a hero, as we've heard other people talk about. So I really do think that in his mind, he basically convinced himself he was doing her some kind of favor. A normal person would immediately drive the van to a hospital and get help for their significant other. He couldn't do that because he would be arrested for assaulting her. And if we know anything about Brian, from what we do know from watching this whole thing play out, he doesn't seem to take any accountability ever for anything. In my opinion, there's no way Brian was going to take her to the hospital and have to face up to what he had done. After all, this is the same guy who ended his life to hide from the consequences of his actions. When he writes that he's not ending his life because he's in fear of punishment, I disagree and think that is exactly why he did it, and that he's again trying to save face. Even after death, Brian is being manipulative, in my opinion, and trying to control the narrative. So a very interesting and disturbing letter all the way around. I feel so bad for Gabby's family and what they've had to go through and what they continue to have to go through, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. So sending our love and prayers to them as well. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the content of Brian's letter, comparing it to the timeline and the facts that we've been given so far? We'll continue to update you on any new developments in this case. Thank you so much for listening. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be notified of my upcoming videos.